Listen carefully, I just blocked NATO corridor access. Radar operator burst into command center, screen in his hands, trembling. Mr. President, 47 vehicles, heavy armor. They're not stopping at the checkpoint. Heart rate spikes. I stand, walk to the tactical display. One command, deploy everything. 12 hours earlier, 2 p.m., NATO headquarters, Brussels. Secure conference room. Generals and diplomats discussing what they call the Sahel corridor. Strategic route connecting their bases in Niger to resources in Chad without paying fees, without acknowledging our sovereignty. But what they didn't know, I've been tracking every vehicle, every flight, every supply shipment for few months. Building evidence, waiting for the right moment. Let me tell you, my intelligence chief showed me the patterns 3 weeks ago. NATO convoys crossing our territory twice weekly, military equipment, surveillance technology, weapons, shipments, all moving through Burkina Faso like we don't exist, like our borders are suggestions, like sovereignty is optional for African nations. I called emergency security meeting, showed my cabinet the surveillance footage, satellite imagery of NATO convoys, transponder data proving they're not civilian, communications intercepts revealing military coordination. My defense minister said what everyone was thinking. Mr. President, if we block them, NATO will claim we're obstructing counterterrorism operations. International pressure will be massive. They might use force. I said what I've been wanting to say since I took office. Since I understood how deeply foreign powers violate our sovereignty, then let them use force. Let them show the world what happens when African nations enforce their borders. Let them prove that all their talk about respecting sovereignty is worthless. I issued the order that afternoon. Presidential decree. Effective immediately. All NATO corridor access through Burkina Faso terminated. All unauthorized military transit prohibited. All foreign forces have 72 hours to clear our territory. But I didn't just issue a decree. I prepared for war. I deployed our newly acquired drone swarm to the northern border. Chinese technology. 73 autonomous drones, equipped with surveillance, electronic warfare, and kinetic capabilities, coordinated by AI systems NATO doesn't know we possess. I positioned anti-aircraft batteries at strategic points along the corridor route, Russian S-400 systems we acquired quietly few months ago. Systems capable of engaging targets NATO thought we couldn't reach. I mobilized 5,000 troops to the border region, not to invade, not to threaten, to defend, to enforce, to show that our borders mean something. My military command established rules of engagement, clear, unambiguous, designed to avoid escalation while enforcing sovereignty. Any NATO vehicle approaching our border gets one warning: radio communication, clear instructions, turn back or face interdiction. One warning, that's it. Any NATO aircraft entering our airspace without authorization gets locked by targeting radar. No warning shot, just radar lock. Proof we can engage if we choose. Any NATO convoy that ignores warnings and crosses our border gets stopped. Not destroyed, stopped, disabled, detained, vehicles immobilized, personnel held for violating sovereignty. November 2nd, 6 p.m., NATO convoy departs their base in Niger. 47 vehicles, 200 personnel, heavy equipment, standard corridor transit. They've done this route 36 times before. Never encountered resistance. Never faced consequences. But this time is different. This time I'm enforcing what they've been violating. 10 p.m. Convoy approaches Burkina Faso border. My radar operators track them from 80 kilometers out. Vehicle composition, speed, formation, everything monitored, everything documented. My communications officer establishes radio contact, professional, clear, firm. NATO convoy approaching Burkina Faso border. This is Burkinabe Defense Command. You are not authorized to transit our territory. Presidential decree issued November 2nd terminates all corridor access. You must turn back immediately. This is your only warning. Silence. Complete. They don't respond. They don't acknowledge. They don't slow down. They keep coming. Speed unchanged. Formation maintained. Like they didn't hear. Like they don't care. Like African sovereignty is something they can ignore. 11 p.m. Convoy crosses into Burkina Faso territory. No authorization. No permission. No respect. That's when I gave the order that changed everything. Launch the swarm. 73 drones lift off simultaneously. Autonomous coordination. No human piloting required. AI systems calculating optimal positioning. Electronic warfare packages activating. The swarm moves like a living organism, flowing, adapting, surrounding the NATO convoy from all directions, altitude varying, speed adjusting, creating a dome of surveillance and threat that's impossible to escape. NATO convoy stops. Finally. Too late. Already violated our sovereignty. Already crossed the line. My communications officer tries contact again. NATO convoy, you have violated Burkina Faso sovereignty. Power down your vehicles. Dismount your personnel. Prepare for detention pending investigation. This time they respond. NATO commander, American accent, arrogant, dismissive. Burkina Faso command, we are conducting authorized counter-terrorism operations under ECOWAS security protocols. We have right of passage through this corridor. Stand down your drones immediately. I take the radio myself. Time for them to understand who they're dealing with. NATO commander, this is President Ibrahim Traoré. You have no authorization. You have no right of passage. You have no ECOWAS security protocol that overrides Burkina Faso sovereignty. You are in violation of our borders. Power down now or face escalation. Mr. President, you don't understand the strategic situation. I understand perfectly. You've been using our territory without permission for few months. That ends today. Power down. We cannot comply. We have operational requirements. I cut him off. Done negotiating with people who think African sovereignty is negotiable. You have 60 seconds. After that, my drones disable your vehicles. Your choice. Silence. 10 seconds. 20. 30. I watch the tactical display. Drones maintaining position. Targeting systems locked. Waiting for my command. 40 seconds. 50. At 57 seconds, NATO convoy powers down. Engines cutting off, one by one. 47 vehicles going silent. 200 NATO personnel realizing they just lost a confrontation with an African nation they thought couldn't challenge them. My ground forces move in, professional, controlled, surround the convoy, secure the personnel, document everything, photographs, video, evidence of NATO violation, evidence of our enforcement, evidence that sovereignty means something. I order the NATO personnel detained, not arrested, detained, held for violating our borders, held until their governments acknowledge what they did, held until they pay for corridor access they've been taking for free. Within 3 hours, my phone explodes with calls. NATO Secretary General, demanding immediate release, threatening consequences, claiming we're obstructing counter-terrorism operations. I let it ring. No answer. They can wait. U.S. Ambassador to Burkina Faso, demanding emergency meeting, warning about bilateral relations, suggesting we're making a serious mistake. I let it ring. They can wait too. French Foreign Ministry, threatening sanctions, warning about ECOWAS pressure, claiming we're destabilizing the region. I let them all wait. Because for once, they're going to deal with Africa on our terms. 6 hours after the detention, I hold a press conference, international media, African networks, global coverage, the NATO vehicles visible behind me, proof of what I'm saying. Last night, a NATO convoy violated Burkina Faso sovereignty, 47 vehicles, 200 personnel, heavy military equipment. They crossed our border without authorization, without permission, without respect for our territorial integrity. I pause. Let the cameras focus on the detained convoy. This is not the first violation. This is the 37th violation. For a few months, NATO has been using what they call the Sahel corridor, a route through our territory. A route they never asked to use. A route they assumed they could take because we're African and our sovereignty doesn't matter. I show satellite imagery on screens behind me. NATO convoys crossing Burkina Faso. Dates, times, frequencies, few months of documented violations. I issued a presidential decree terminating corridor access. NATO ignored it. They crossed our border anyway. So I enforced our sovereignty. With drones. With troops. With the understanding that borders mean something. African journalists stand, applauding, some crying, understanding exactly what this represents. Western correspondents sit frozen, typing frantically, understanding this is a major international incident. The NATO personnel are detained, not arrested, detained. They violated our borders. They face consequences. They will be released when NATO acknowledges the violation. When they agree to respect our sovereignty, when they understand that Africa is not their corridor. I look directly into the cameras, knowing NATO commanders are watching, knowing Western governments are calculating their response. Let this be clear to every foreign military force operating in Africa. Our borders are real. Our sovereignty is real. Our ability to enforce both is real. Test us again and face the same consequences. The reaction is immediate, explosive, unprecedented. NATO issues emergency statement. Burkina Faso has detained NATO personnel conducting authorized security operations. This action threatens regional stability and undermines counterterrorism efforts. We demand immediate release and restoration of corridor access. But they don't deny the violation. Don't claim they had authorization. Don't explain why they thought they could use our territory without asking. African Union emergency session. 54 member states. I present evidence of NATO corridor violations, not just in Burkina Faso, across Africa, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Somalia, unauthorized military transit, sovereignty violations, systematic disrespect. Kenya's president stands. NATO has been using a corridor through our territory too, connecting their base in Djibouti to operations in South Sudan. We never authorized it. We're terminating access today. Tanzania. Same situation, unauthorized overflights, unauthorized naval access, terminated. The pattern emerges. NATO has been treating Africa like their private military highway, using our territory, ignoring our sovereignty, assuming we're too weak to stop them. Mali, Niger, and I announce joint action. Any NATO corridor through our territories requires formal authorization, requires payment, requires respect, or gets blocked, collectively, simultaneously, permanently. We establish the African Airspace and Territory Sovereignty Network, real-time coordination, shared radar data, joint enforcement. If NATO violates one nation's borders, all nations respond. We deploy integrated air defense across the Sahel, not theoretical capability, not future planning, actual operational systems positioned and ready. Russian S-400 systems in Burkina Faso, 4 batteries, 16 launchers, range of 400 kilometers, capable of engaging aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, technology NATO assumed we couldn't acquire, capability they thought African nations couldn't operate. Chinese HQ-9 systems in Mali, 3 batteries, 12 launchers, advanced radar, electronic warfare integration, coordinated with our S-400 network through secure data links. Real-time threat sharing, overlapping coverage zones, no gaps, no blind spots. Niger deploys Panzer S-1 systems, short-range air defense, mobile, rapid deployment, covering the gaps between long-range systems, creating layered defense that's harder to penetrate than anything NATO expected to face in Africa. But here's what terrifies them most. We're not just deploying these systems, we're integrating them. Creating a unified air defense network across 3 nations, coordinated, synchronized, operated by African personnel trained in Russia and China, coordinated coverage, overlapping protection. One aircraft entering Burkina Bay airspace gets tracked by all 3 nations simultaneously. One threat detected triggers alerts across the entire network. One engagement decision gets supported by multiple radar sources confirming the target. Capability NATO didn't know we possessed. Capability they didn't think we could afford. Capability they assumed we couldn't operate effectively even if we acquired it. They were wrong on every count, and their convoy detention proved it. We announce corridor access fees publicly. Presidential decree, published in international registries, filed with African Union, submitted to United Nations, legal, official, enforceable. NATO wants to use African territory for military transit? Pay for it. $50,000 per vehicle, $100,000 per aircraft, $500,000 per convoy. Commercial rates for commercial use of sovereign territory. Not negotiable, not flexible, not optional. You want to cross our borders with military equipment? You pay. Simple, clear, sovereign. The fee structure is calculated precisely, based on road damage from heavy vehicles, based on airspace management costs, based on security requirements, based on sovereignty value. $50,000 per military vehicle accounts for infrastructure wear. Our roads weren't designed for 40-ton armored personnel carriers. Every NATO convoy damages infrastructure we have to repair. They pay for that damage. $100,000 per military aircraft covers airspace management. Our air traffic control has to coordinate military flights. Our radar has to track them. Our communications have to monitor them. That costs money. They pay for those services. $500,000 per convoy is sovereignty fee. You're crossing our territory with foreign military force. That requires authorization. That requires oversight. That requires accepting temporary presence of armed foreigners. That has value. They pay for that privilege. NATO refuses. Immediately. Predictably. Arrogantly. Claims military operations shouldn't require payment. Claims counterterrorism justifies free passage. Claims African nations should support Western security operations as contribution to global stability. Translation: you should let us use your territory for free because we're NATO and you're Africa, and that's how this relationship has always worked. I respond publicly, press conference, international media, bluntly, with the contempt their position deserves. NATO has a $1.2 trillion annual budget. They spend more on military operations in 1 month than Burkina Faso's entire GDP. They can afford to pay African nations for using our territory. If they refuse, they don't transit. Simple. I show the calculations on screens behind me. NATO's budget, broken down. $1.2 trillion annually. $100 billion monthly. $3.3 billion daily. They spend $3.3 billion every single day, but they claim they can't pay $500,000 to cross our territory legally. They claim respecting our sovereignty is too expensive. That tells you exactly how much they value African nations. African journalists stand, applauding, understanding the mathematics of disrespect. Western correspondents type frantically, knowing this is quotable, knowing this will spread, knowing I just made NATO's position look absurd. Let me be absolutely clear. NATO can pay, NATO can negotiate, NATO can respect our sovereignty, or NATO can find another route. Those are the options. There is no free passage anymore. 3 days after the detention, NATO sends a delegation, not demanding I come to Brussels, not summoning me to their headquarters, not treating this like I'm subordinate requiring instruction. They come to Ouagadougou, to my office, to my territory, to negotiate on my terms. That shift alone tells me I'm winning. Senior NATO official arrives. European, mid-50s. Diplomatic experience written across his carefully neutral expression, trying to find a compromise that lets NATO save face while acknowledging reality. My protocol officer escorts him to my office. I don't stand when he enters, don't extend my hand, don't offer the courtesies usually given to visiting dignitaries. He violated our sovereignty. He gets treated accordingly. Mr. President, thank you for seeing me. We need to resolve this situation. The detained personnel, the corridor access, regional security requires cooperation. I lean back in my chair. Let him finish. Let him exhaust his talking points. Let him use all the diplomatic language designed to make NATO demands sound reasonable. Then I speak. Cooperation requires respect. Respect requires acknowledging sovereignty. You've been violating our borders for 18 months. Where's the cooperation in that? He shifts in his seat, uncomfortable, realizing I'm not going to accept diplomatic deflection. The corridor serves regional counterterrorism objectives, ECOWAS security protocols, shared threats requiring coordinated response. The corridor serves NATO strategic interests. Don't insult me by calling it counterterrorism. You're moving military equipment, you're establishing logistics routes, you're preparing for operations that have nothing to do with terrorism. I've seen the cargo manifests. I know what you're transporting. His face tightens, realizes I have more intelligence than he expected, more evidence than he's comfortable with. You're moving surveillance equipment to monitor Chinese activities in Chad. You're transporting weapons to opposition groups in Sudan. You're establishing forward operating bases for operations against governments you want to destabilize. That's not counterterrorism, that's geopolitical positioning. Silence. He can't deny it without lying, can't confirm it without admitting NATO's actual objectives. Trapped by truth he didn't expect me to know. What would it take to resolve this? To release the detained personnel? To restore corridor access? I lean forward. Time to establish terms that make this worth my while. 3 things. First, NATO acknowledges the sovereignty violation, publicly, officially, no diplomatic language, no regrettable misunderstanding phrasing. Clear admission you crossed our borders without authorization for 18 months. That's difficult. It would set a precedent that could complicate operations in other regions. That's my first condition, non-negotiable. You violated our sovereignty. You acknowledge it, publicly, or your personnel stay detained indefinitely. He swallows, realizes I'm serious, that this isn't opening negotiating position, this is requirement. Second, NATO pays for corridor access, retroactive payment for 18 months of unauthorized use, 37 convoys, average 40 vehicles per convoy, $50,000 per vehicle. That's $74 million, plus fees for any future transit at published rates. The financial implications would be significant. NATO budgets are allocated years in advance. Finding $74 million means I cut him off. Done listening to excuses from an organization with $1 trillion budget. The sovereignty implications of you using our territory for free are significant. You've been saving money by violating our borders. Now you pay what you owe. $74 million is 0.006% of your annual budget. You spend more than that on coffee for your headquarters staff. His jaw tightens, angry that I've done the mathematics, angry that I can demonstrate how little this actually costs them, angry that I'm not accepting their poverty plea. Third, NATO establishes formal agreements with every African nation whose territory you want to use. Written, authorized, respectful, signed by heads of state, published publicly, with payment terms, with authorization procedures, with respect for sovereignty. These conditions are unreasonable. They would fundamentally change how NATO operates in Africa. These conditions are sovereignty. They're what every other region gets. You don't cross European borders without authorization. You don't use American territory without permission. You don't violate Canadian airspace without consequences. Why should Africa be different? Silence. Because he knows the answer. Because Africa has been different because we've been weak. Because we've accepted violations. Because we've tolerated disrespect. And I'm ending that. Accept them or your personnel stay detained. Your corridor stays closed. Your operations in the Sahel get significantly more complicated. Your logistics routes get longer. Your costs increase. Your timeline extends. All because you refuse to respect sovereignty. He stands, no agreement, no resolution, just understanding that I'm serious. I'll convey your position to NATO leadership. You do that, and while you're convey this too. Every day your personnel stay detained, the retroactive payment increases, $50,000 per day per person. 200 personnel, that's $10 million per day. You're currently at 3 days, $30 million added to the $74 million you already owe. Tomorrow it's $40 million, day after $50 million. Time costs money when you violate sovereignty. His face goes pale, realizes I'm not just making demands, I'm imposing costs that escalate daily, creating financial pressure that makes quick resolution cheaper than prolonged standoff. He leaves, walking quickly, already calculating how much this is costing NATO, already realizing that my terms are going to look reasonable compared to the alternative. 4 days after detention, NATO personnel still held, corridor still closed, Western pressure mounting like storm clouds gathering. U.S. threatens sanctions, Treasury Department considering asset freezes, State Department warning about bilateral relations, Pentagon suggesting military options. All the standard tools they use when African nations don't comply. I ignore every threat, because I have something they need more than they can hurt me. I have their personnel. 200 NATO soldiers sitting in comfortable detention. Well fed, well treated, but detained. Every day they're held is embarrassment for NATO. Every day is proof an African nation can challenge Western military power. I have their corridor, strategic route they've relied on for 18 months, route that cuts transit time by 40%, route that saves them millions in operational costs, closed, forcing them to use longer routes through less stable regions. I have leverage, real leverage, the kind that makes threats hollow, because what can they do? Invade Burkina Faso to rescue 200 soldiers who aren't in danger. Launch military operation that proves everything I'm saying about NATO disrespecting African sovereignty? They can't. The optics are impossible. France threatens ECOWAS intervention, calls emergency meeting, claims I'm destabilizing the region, suggests other African nations should pressure me to comply. French Foreign Minister issues statement, Burkina Faso's actions threaten regional security cooperation. ECOWAS must address this situation before it undermines counterterrorism efforts across the Sahel. Translation: France wants other African nations to do their dirty work, wants ECOWAS to pressure me because France can't do it directly without proving their neo-colonial power trying to control African decisions. But other African nations are watching, learning, understanding that saying no to NATO is possible. ECOWAS emergency session. I attend via video conference. 15 member states, some sympathetic, some pressured by France, some genuinely concerned about regional implications. Nigerian president speaks first. Carefully, diplomatically. President Traoré, your concerns about sovereignty are valid, but detained NATO personnel creates complications for all of us. Perhaps a compromise? I respond bluntly. Time to educate fellow African leaders about what's actually at stake. Compromise? NATO violated our borders 37 times, transported military equipment through our territory without authorization, treated Burkina Faso like we don't exist. And you want me to compromise? Senegalese president, but the detained personnel are being held for violating sovereignty, same as any other border violation, same as we'd hold anyone who crosses our territory illegally with weapons. Why should NATO get special treatment? Ghanaian president, more supportive. What President Traoré is doing benefits all of us. NATO has been using African territory like it's theirs. Someone had to say no. Ivorian president, clearly pressured by France. But the economic consequences, the security implications, we need Western cooperation. We need Western respect. Cooperation without respect is subordination. I'm not subordinating Burkina Faso sovereignty to NATO convenience. The session ends without consensus. Some nations supporting me, some opposing, most watching to see what happens, waiting to see if I can actually win this confrontation. But the lack of ECOWAS condemnation is victory itself. France wanted unified African pressure. They got divided opinions. That's enough. 5 days after detention, my phone rings. Private number, NATO Secretary General himself, not sending subordinates anymore, coming to negotiate directly. President Traoré, I'm calling to discuss resolution. I'm listening. NATO is prepared to acknowledge irregularities in our corridor usage. We're prepared to discuss compensation framework. We're prepared to formalize future arrangements. Notice the language. Irregularities, not violations. Discuss compensation, not pay what's owed. Formalize arrangements, not respect sovereignty. Still trying to minimize. Still trying to avoid full acknowledgement. Not good enough. I gave your representative my terms. They haven't changed. Full acknowledgement, full payment, formal agreements. Accept all three, or this conversation is over. Silence. He's calculating, weighing costs, understanding that I'm not negotiating down. The financial amount is non-negotiable. $74 million retroactive, plus $50 million detention fees, plus future payments at published rates. Total $124 million to resolve this situation. That's significant. That's 0.01% of your annual budget. You spend more than that on a single fighter jet. This is about whether you respect African sovereignty enough to pay what you owe. More silence, longer this time. I can hear him breathing, thinking, realizing he has no good options. If we agree to these terms, the personnel are released immediately. If you agree publicly, official statement, press conference, no private deal, public acknowledgement, then yes, immediate release. We'll need to coordinate the announcement. You have 6 hours. After that, detention fees increase to $100,000 per person per day. $20 million daily. Your choice. I hang up. Don't wait for response. Don't give him time to negotiate further. Set deadline. Create pressure. Force decision. 4 hours later, NATO issues official statement. NATO acknowledges that military transit through Burkina Faso territory over the past 18 months occurred without proper authorization from the government of Burkina Faso. We recognize this violated Burkina Faso sovereignty. We apologize for this violation and commit to establishing formal agreements with all African nations whose territory NATO operations may require. We have agreed to compensate Burkina Faso for unauthorized corridor usage and will implement proper authorization procedures for all future operations. Not perfect language. Still diplomatic, but clear enough. Violated sovereignty. Apologize. Compensate. The words I demanded. I release the NATO personnel immediately. Unharmed, well treated, but thoroughly educated about African sovereignty. They board transport aircraft, fly back to their base in Niger, but they know. They experienced detention by an African nation. They felt what it's like when sovereignty gets enforced. They'll remember. The corridor remains closed until formal agreements are signed, until payments are made, until respect is demonstrated through actions, not just words. 2 weeks later, NATO delegation returns to Ouagadougou, this time with documents, formal corridor access agreement. I read every word, every clause, every provision. My legal team reviews it. My cabinet examines it. We negotiate changes. We demand clarifications. We ensure it protects our sovereignty. Key provisions. NATO must request authorization 72 hours before any transit. Must provide cargo manifests. Must specify routes. Must pay fees before authorization granted. Must accept Burkina Faso monitoring of all convoys. Must allow inspection of vehicles if sovereignty concerns arise. Violations result in immediate suspension of corridor access. Repeated violations result in permanent termination. No exceptions. No special circumstances. No NATO privilege. I sign it publicly. Press conference. International media. The agreement displayed on screens. Every provision visible. This is what sovereignty looks like. Written agreements, clear terms, mutual respect. NATO wanted to use our territory. Now they can, legally, with authorization, with payment, with respect. I announce similar agreements being negotiated with Mali and Niger. Coordinated approach, unified terms, collective sovereignty. Any foreign military wanting to operate in the Sahel now understands you ask permission, you pay fees, you respect sovereignty, or you don't operate here. Simple. The first payment arrives 3 days later. $124 million. Wire transfer to Burkina Faso. Central bank. Verified. Confirmed. Real. I allocate the funds publicly. $50 million to infrastructure repair. Roads damaged by NATO convoys. $30 million to military modernization. More drones. More air defense. More capability to enforce sovereignty. $24 million to education. Schools. Hospitals. Healthcare. $20 million to African Sovereignty Fund. New initiative. Helping other African nations acquire surveillance technology. Helping them monitor their borders. Helping them enforce their sovereignty. The message is clear. Sovereignty violations don't just cost money. They fund the capability to prevent future violations. Few months later, the African Airspace and Territory Sovereignty Network operates across 18 nations. Not theoretical. Not planned. Operating. Functional. Effective. Integrated radar coverage from Mauritania to Sudan, from Libya to Nigeria, coordinated air defense covering critical corridors, shared intelligence about unauthorized military activities, joint enforcement protocols. Any unauthorized military transit gets detected by multiple nations simultaneously, gets challenged by whichever nation has jurisdiction, gets stopped if it doesn't comply. Real-time threat sharing. Mali detects unauthorized aircraft. Alert goes to Burkina Faso and Niger within seconds. All three nations track it. All three can engage if necessary. Coordinated response to coordinated threat. NATO learns to ask permission. Every convoy now submits authorization requests 72 hours in advance. Provides cargo manifests. Specifies routes. Pays fees. Waits for approval. Sometimes we deny requests. Sometimes routes conflict with our operations. Sometimes cargo raises sovereignty concerns. Sometimes we just say no because we can, because sovereignty means having that choice. NATO adapts, frustrated, angry, but adapting. Because the alternative is longer routes through less stable regions, higher costs, greater delays, more complications. To pay fees, $500,000 per convoy, $100,000 per aircraft. Money that funds African infrastructure, African military capability, African sovereignty. To respect sovereignty, written agreements, clear procedures, mutual respect, the relationship they should have established from the beginning. Because the alternative is detention, interdiction, consequences. The alternative is what happened to that convoy, what can happen again anytime they forget. Western military planners realize Africa isn't their corridor anymore. Planning documents change. Operation timelines extend. Logistics calculations include African authorization procedures. Budget projections include sovereignty fees. Africa isn't assumed access anymore, isn't automatic transit, isn't taken for granted. Africa is sovereign territory, requiring authorization, requiring payment, requiring respect. The drone swarm that stopped that NATO convoy, it was a warning, a demonstration, proof that African nations can enforce their borders, proof that we have capability NATO didn't expect, proof that sovereignty isn't just words anymore. We've deployed 12 more swarms since then, covering critical corridors, monitoring unauthorized incursions, ready to respond. Each swarm has 73 autonomous drones, AI coordinated, electronic warfare capable, kinetic options available, operating range of 200 kilometers, endurance of 6 hours, rechargeable at forward bases. Total capability, 949 drones, covering 2,400 kilometers of borders and corridors, monitoring 24/7, detecting everything that moves. Ready to enforce sovereignty anywhere, anytime. We've established no-fly zones over sensitive areas, military installations, government facilities, critical infrastructure, enforced by integrated air defense, tested by unauthorized NATO flights, proven effective when we locked targeting radar on aircraft that ignored warnings. 3 times since the corridor incident, NATO aircraft have tested our no-fly zones. 3 times we've locked targeting radar. 3 times they've diverted. 3 times they've learned we're serious. We haven't fired, haven't needed to. The radar lock is message enough. We see you, we can engage you, comply or face consequences. Every time they've complied. We've created a new reality, where African sovereignty means something tangible, where borders get enforced with technology and determination, where violations have consequences that foreign militaries actually fear. This isn't theoretical sovereignty. This is practical sovereignty. Enforced sovereignty. Real sovereignty. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. I blocked NATO's corridor. I detained their personnel. I forced them to acknowledge our sovereignty. I made them pay for access they'd been taking for free. I'm not the president who accepts violations, who tolerates disrespect, who allows foreign militaries to treat our territory like their property, who signs away sovereignty for aid or approval or peaceful relations. I'm the president who deployed drones, who enforced borders, who proved African nations can challenge NATO and win. Not with rhetoric, not with diplomatic protests, not with appeals to international law, with actual military capability. With technology they didn't think we could acquire. With determination they didn't think we possessed. With willingness to confront Western military power they assumed we'd never demonstrate. 73 autonomous drones, Chinese technology, AI coordination, electronic warfare packages, kinetic capabilities, deployed to northern border. Operational within hours of NATO's refusal to acknowledge our sovereignty, ready to enforce what diplomacy couldn't achieve. But here's what they still don't understand. Those drones were just the visible capability, just the warning shot, just the demonstration of what we're willing to use. We have 12 more swarms positioned across Burkina Faso, CI 949 total drones, covering every critical border crossing, every strategic corridor, every route foreign militaries might use to violate our sovereignty, all coordinated, all operational, all ready to respond. We have integrated air defense, S-400 systems with 400-kilometer range, capable of engaging aircraft at altitudes and distances NATO thought we couldn't reach. Operated by Burkinabe personnel trained in Russia for 18 months. Not advisors operating our systems, our people, our capability, our sovereignty enforced by our hands. We have surveillance networks they don't know about, satellite access through partnerships with China and Russia, ground-based radar covering approaches they think are blind spots. Human intelligence networks in border regions reporting unauthorized movements. The president who turned sovereignty from concept into reality, who demonstrated that African nations have capability to defend their territory, who showed that saying no to Western military power is possible. Sovereignty used to be theoretical in Africa, written in constitutions, declared in speeches, recognized in international law, but not enforced, not defended, not real in any practical sense. Foreign militaries crossed our borders whenever convenient, used our airspace without authorization, established bases without permission, conducted operations without consultation, and we accepted it because we thought we had no choice, because we thought challenging Western power was impossible. I proved it's not impossible. That NATO convoy detained, 200 personnel held, 47 vehicles immobilized, all because they crossed our border without authorization. All because I decided sovereignty means something. The demonstration wasn't just about that convoy. It was about establishing precedent, proving capability, showing every African nation that enforcement is possible. That Western military power can be challenged, that sovereignty can be real if we're willing to defend it. 3 months after the detention, 7 more African nations deployed similar drone capabilities: Mali, Niger, Chad, Tanzania, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, all acquiring technology, all training personnel, all preparing to enforce their borders. 6 months after, 14 nations established integrated air defense networks, coordinated coverage, shared threat data, collective response protocols. What NATO did to one nation triggers response from multiple nations, collective sovereignty backed by collective capability. 1 year after, 23 African nations have formal military cooperation agreements focused on sovereignty enforcement, not defense pacts against external threats. Sovereignty enforcement agreements, mutual support for border control, shared intelligence about unauthorized foreign military activities, coordinated responses to violations. The corridor incident didn't just defend Burkina Faso's sovereignty, it catalyzed continental transformation. It proved African nations can enforce sovereignty if we acquire capability and demonstrate willingness. I'm the president who made NATO negotiate on African soil, who made them acknowledge violations publicly, who made them pay $124 million for disrespecting sovereignty, who made them sign agreements they never wanted to sign. That matters more than the money, more than the specific corridor, more than even the detained personnel. What matters is the power dynamic shift. Before the corridor incident, NATO summoned African leaders to Brussels when they wanted discussions, made us come to their headquarters, made us negotiate on their territory, made us accept the psychological subordination of being summoned. After the corridor incident, NATO comes to Ouagadougou, sends delegations to my office, negotiates on African soil, accepts the psychological reality that they need something from us, that they're seeking our authorization, that the power dynamic has shifted. Before, NATO issued statements about what they would do in Africa, announced operations, informed us as courtesy, not seeking permission, assumed compliance because they assumed we couldn't refuse. After, NATO submits requests, formal applications for corridor access, detailed manifests of what they're transporting, specific routes they want to use, and they wait for our approval. They wait because they know refusal is possible. They wait because detention proved we can enforce sovereignty. Before, violations had no consequences. NATO crossed borders without authorization. We protested diplomatically. They ignored protests. Nothing changed. Pattern repeated for decades. After, violations cost $124 million. After, violations result in detention. After, violations trigger public acknowledgement and formal apologies. After, violations have consequences that NATO actually fears. The agreements they signed aren't just about corridor access. They're frameworks establishing new relationship between African nations and Western military powers. Written authorization requirements. Every military transit requires formal request 72 hours in advance. No assumed access. No automatic approval. No taking African territory for granted. Detailed manifest requirements. Every convoy must declare what it's transporting. Every aircraft must specify its cargo. No secret shipments. No concealed military equipment. No violations of sovereignty through deception. Payment obligations. Every transit costs money. Every use of African territory generates revenue for African nations. No free passage. No exploitation of African infrastructure without compensation. No treating our territory like it's theirs. Inspection rights. African nations can inspect any convoy if sovereignty concerns arise, can verify manifests, can ensure compliance, can enforce terms. Real sovereignty includes verification capability, violation consequences. Unauthorized transit results in immediate suspension of corridor access. Repeated violations result in permanent termination, no exceptions, no special NATO privilege, no Western military superiority overriding African authority. The corridor they thought they owned, closed until they paid. The access they assumed was free, costs $500,000 per convoy now. The sovereignty they ignored, enforced with drones and determination. That corridor represented everything wrong with Africa's relationship with Western powers. They used it for 18 months without asking. 37 convoys, 1,480 vehicles, millions of dollars in operational cost savings, all extracted from African territory without compensation. They saved money by violating our sovereignty, shortened transit times by crossing our borders without authorization, improved their logistics efficiency by treating Burkina Faso like their property. Every convoy that crossed saved NATO approximately $200,000 in fuel and operational costs compared to alternative routes. 37 convoys, $7.4 million in savings, extracted from African territory, without payment, without permission, without respect. Now it costs them $500,000 per convoy. Now the savings become costs. Now using African territory is more expensive than alternative routes. Now they have to calculate whether corridor access is worth the price. Some convoys they cancel, not worth $500,000 when alternative routes cost less. Some operations they modify, not worth the authorization hassle when other approaches exist. Some activities they abandon, not worth the sovereignty fees when the mission isn't critical. The corridor isn't just closed, it's transformed from assumed access to expensive privilege, from free exploitation to costly authorization, from sovereignty violation to sovereignty enforcement. And that transformation spreads. Mali charges similar fees. Niger implements comparable requirements. Chad establishes equivalent procedures. The entire Sahel region transforms from NATO corridor to sovereign territory requiring authorization and payment. This is just the beginning, not the end, not the peak, the beginning of something larger, something more significant, something that will reshape how foreign powers interact with Africa. I see it already, the ripple effects spreading, the precedent being cited, the model being copied, the transformation accelerating beyond what I initially imagined. The beginning of African nations controlling their own territory, actually controlling it, not theoretically, not nominally, actually enforcing borders, actually requiring authorization, actually imposing costs on violations. Tanzania announces port access fees for foreign military vessels, $100,000 per ship per day. NATO naval vessels that use Dar es Salaam port for resupply now pay or use more distant ports. Sovereignty enforced through pricing. Kenya implements airspace transit fees, $50,000 per military aircraft. NATO flights that routinely crossed Kenyan airspace now file detailed flight plans and pay fees or route around Kenya. Sovereignty enforced through air traffic control. South Africa requires advance authorization for any foreign military equipment entering their territory. 72 hours notice. Detailed manifests. Inspection rights. NATO operations that assume South African cooperation now submit formal requests. Sovereignty enforced through bureaucratic control. Zimbabwe bans all foreign military transit without case-by-case presidential authorization, no standing agreements, no automatic approval, every request evaluated individually. NATO can't plan operations assuming Zimbabwean territory is available. Sovereignty enforced through discretionary authority. Each nation implements sovereignty enforcement differently. Different fees, different procedures, different requirements, but all implementing the same principle. African territory requires African authorization. Foreign military access requires permission, payment, and respect. The beginning of foreign militaries asking permission, not assuming access, not taking routes for granted, not treating Africa like their logistics network, actually asking, actually waiting for approval, actually respecting sovereignty. NATO now maintains liaison officers in 18 African capitals. Their job: submit authorization requests, negotiate access terms, maintain relationships that enable operations. The existence of these positions proves the transformation. NATO didn't need African liaison officers when they assumed access. They need them now because access requires negotiation. U.S. Africa Command now budgets $50 million annually for African sovereignty fees. Line item in their budget: planned expenditure, accepted cost of operations. The budget line proves sovereignty enforcement works. They're paying because they have to, because refusal means no access. French military operations in Sahel now include sovereignty compliance in their planning timelines. 2 weeks added to every operation for authorization requests and approvals. The timeline extension proves African nations control access. French military can't move as quickly because we control the territory they need to cross. British special operations in East Africa now require Foreign Office coordination with African governments before deployment, diplomatic authorization before military action. The coordination requirement proves sovereignty matters. British military can't operate without African government approval. The beginning of sovereignty that's real, that gets enforced, that has teeth, that foreign powers fear violating, that costs them money and embarrassment when they ignore it. Real sovereignty isn't declared. It's demonstrated, it's enforced, it's defended, it's proven through action, not words. I demonstrated it by detaining NATO personnel, by closing the corridor, by demanding payment, by forcing acknowledgement, by making sovereignty violation costly enough that foreign powers think twice before crossing our borders. Real sovereignty has consequences for violations, not diplomatic protests, not UN resolutions, not international court cases. Immediate, tangible, costly consequences that foreign powers actually fear. NATO fears detention now, fears their personnel being held, fears the embarrassment of African nations enforcing sovereignty against Western military power. That fear makes them comply. That fear makes them ask permission. That fear makes sovereignty real. NATO fears corridor closure, fears losing access to routes they've relied on, fears operational complications from having to use alternative routes. That fear makes them pay fees. That fear makes them submit authorization requests. That fear makes sovereignty enforceable. NATO fears public acknowledgement of violations, fears admitting they disrespected African sovereignty, fears the precedent of apologizing to African nations. That fear makes them negotiate. That fear makes them sign agreements. That fear makes sovereignty powerful. They thought Africa was their corridor, their assumed route, their free passage, their logistics convenience. They thought African borders were suggestions. African sovereignty was theoretical. African nations were too weak to enforce anything. For decades, they were right. African borders were suggestions. African sovereignty was theoretical. African nations were too weak or too dependent or too intimidated to enforce anything. They crossed our borders whenever convenient. We protested. They ignored protests. Pattern repeated endlessly. Our weakness confirmed. Their dominance reinforced. Relationship of subordination normalized. They used our airspace without authorization. We objected diplomatically. They continued operations. Our objections meaningless. Their access assumed. Relationship of exploitation maintained. They established military bases on our territory. We negotiated terms that favored them. They violated those terms. We accepted violations. Our sovereignty theoretical. Their power practical. Relationship of neocolonialism perpetuated. That was the reality. For decades, for generations. Since independence, that wasn't really independence. Since sovereignty, that wasn't really sovereignty. Since borders that weren't really borders. But that reality ended November 3rd, 2024, 11 p.m. When NATO convoy crossed into Burkina Faso without authorization. When I gave the order to deploy the drone swarm. When 73 autonomous drones surrounded that convoy, when NATO personnel powered down their vehicles and accepted detention. That moment ended decades of assumed access, ended generations of sovereignty violations without consequences, ended the reality where African nations were too weak to enforce borders. We showed them Africa is our continent, our territory, our sovereignty, our borders to enforce. Not through rhetoric, through action, through detention, through corridor closure, through forcing NATO to negotiate on our terms, through making them pay $124 million, through proving capability they didn't think we possessed. We showed them African nations have capability, technology, determination, willingness to confront Western military power, ability to win those confrontations, capability, drone swarms, integrated air defense, surveillance networks, intelligence systems, technology acquired through partnerships with China and Russia, technology operated by African personnel, technology proving we can defend our sovereignty, technology, S-400 air defense systems, HQ-9 missiles, Pantsir short-range systems, autonomous drones, electronic warfare equipment, satellite access, radar networks, all operational, all proving African nations can acquire advanced military technology, determination, willingness to detain NATO personnel despite threats, willingness to close corridor despite pressure, willingness to demand payment despite intimidation, willingness to enforce sovereignty despite costs, determination proving African leaders can stand against Western power, willingness to confront, not avoiding confrontation, not seeking compromise that preserves Western access, not accepting sovereignty violations for peaceful relations, actually confronting, actually challenging, actually refusing, willingness proving African nations won't subordinate sovereignty to Western convenience. Ability to win, NATO paid $124 million, NATO acknowledged violations, NATO signed agreements, NATO now asks permission, we won, not theoretically, practically, measurably, undeniably. Ability proving African nations can challenge Western military power and prevail. We showed them that NATO's trillion-dollar budget doesn't override sovereignty, that Western military superiority doesn't erase borders, that African nations can say no and make it stick. NATO's budget is 100 times larger than Burkina Faso's GDP. Their military capability is vastly superior to ours. Their technology is more advanced. Their forces are better equipped. Their power is greater by every conventional measure. But none of that overrode our sovereignty. None of that prevented us from detaining their convoy. None of that forced us to back down. None of that made us accept their violations. Because sovereignty isn't about relative power. It's about willingness to enforce. It's about having enough capability to impose costs. It's about demonstrating that violations have consequences. We had enough capability. 73 drones was enough to stop 47 vehicles. S-400 systems were enough to threaten NATO aircraft. 200 detained personnel were enough to create embarrassment NATO wanted to end. We had enough determination, willing to face sanctions, willing to endure pressure, willing to accept isolation, willing to enforce sovereignty despite costs. We had enough leverage. NATO needed their personnel back. NATO needed corridor access. NATO needed to avoid precedent of African nations successfully defying Western military power. And we control who crosses it. We control the terms. We control the costs. We control the authorization. We control everything. Every NATO convoy now requires our authorization. We decide if they cross. We decide when they cross. We decide what routes they use. We decide what they pay. We control everything about their access to our territory. Every NATO aircraft now requires our clearance. We decide if they fly over our airspace. We decide what altitudes they use. We decide what flight paths they follow. We decide what fees they pay. We control everything about their access to our airspace. Every NATO operation now requires our cooperation. They can't assume access, can't plan operations without considering our authorization, can't execute missions without our approval. We control whether their operations are possible. That control is sovereignty, real sovereignty, enforced sovereignty, sovereignty that matters because it affects what foreign powers can and cannot do. That NATO convoy that crossed our border without permission? Detained. That corridor they used for 18 months without authorization? Closed until they paid? That sovereignty they violated repeatedly? Enforced with consequences they felt. The detention lasted 5 days, long enough to prove we were serious, long enough to impose costs, long enough to force NATO to negotiate, long enough to demonstrate that African nations can hold Western military personnel accountable. 5 days of NATO scrambling, 5 days of diplomatic pressure, 5 days of threats and negotiations, 5 days proving that we wouldn't back down, 5 days that changed everything. The corridor closure lasted 2 weeks, long enough to disrupt NATO operations, long enough to force route changes, long enough to impose operational costs, long enough to prove that African nations can close access Western militaries rely on. 2 weeks of NATO using longer routes, 2 weeks of increased operational costs, 2 weeks of mission delays, 2 weeks proving that we control access to our territory, 2 weeks that establish new reality. The sovereignty enforcement is permanent. Not 5 days, not 2 weeks. Permanent. Every convoy now requires authorization. Every aircraft now requires clearance. Every operation now requires cooperation. Permanent transformation of how NATO operates in Africa. The drone swarm that stopped them? Warning to every foreign military operating in Africa, warning that African nations are watching, that we have capability, that we will enforce sovereignty, that violations have consequences. 73 drones surrounding that convoy, visible demonstration of capability, undeniable proof of surveillance, clear warning of enforcement capability. Every foreign military operating in Africa saw that demonstration. Everyone understood the warning. Chinese military attachés requested briefings on our drone capabilities, interested in what technology we're using, interested in how we're deploying it, interested in African nations' growing military capability. Russian Defense Ministry sent delegation to discuss expanding cooperation, interested in selling more systems, interested in training more personnel, interested in African market for military technology. American intelligence agencies updated their assessments of African military capabilities. Burkina Faso moved from negligible to moderate air defense capability. Mali and Niger similarly upgraded, assessments proving we changed their calculations. French military revised their operational planning for Sahel region. Now includes sovereignty compliance requirements and potential interdiction risks. Planning changes proving we changed their operations. British Defense Ministry circulated memo about evolving African military capabilities and increased enforcement of territorial sovereignty. Memo proving we changed their understanding of what's possible in Africa. The agreements they signed? Framework for how foreign powers interact with Africa now. Written terms, clear procedures, mutual respect, payment for access, acknowledgement of sovereignty. Those agreements aren't just about NATO corridor access. They're templates, models, precedents. Other African nations are using similar language in their negotiations with foreign militaries. Tanzania's port access agreement with U.S. Navy uses similar authorization procedures. Kenya's airspace agreement with British RAF uses comparable fee structures. South Africa's basing agreement with European forces uses equivalent sovereignty protections. The framework is spreading. The model is being copied. The precedent is being cited. What started as Burkina Faso enforcing sovereignty against NATO corridor violations has become continental template for how African nations interact with foreign militaries. The $124 million they paid, proof that sovereignty violations cost money, proof that African nations can impose financial consequences, proof that disrespect isn't free anymore. $74 million for 18 months of unauthorized corridor use. $50 million for 5 days of personnel detention. Total $124 million. Real money. Actual payment. Verified transfer. Proof that sovereignty enforcement generates revenue. That money funded infrastructure repair. $50 million fixing roads damaged by NATO convoys. Proof that they pay for damage they cause. That money funded military modernization. $30 million for additional drones and air defense systems. Proof that sovereignty violations fund capability to prevent future violations. That money funded education and healthcare. $24 million for schools and hospitals. Proof that sovereignty enforcement benefits our people. That money funded African Sovereignty Fund. $20 million, helping other African nations acquire surveillance and enforcement capability. Proof that sovereignty enforcement spreads. The 18 other nations in our sovereignty network. Proof that this isn't isolated. Proof that African nations are coordinating. Proof that collective sovereignty is stronger than individual sovereignty. Mali, Niger, Chad, Tanzania, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Botswana, Cameroon. 18 nations. Coordinated enforcement, shared intelligence, mutual support. When NATO violates Malian sovereignty, Burkina Faso and Niger receive alerts within minutes. When unauthorized aircraft crosses Kenyan airspace, Tanzania and Ethiopia track it simultaneously. When foreign military conducts unauthorized operations in Chad, the entire network monitors and documents. Collective sovereignty is stronger because violations affect multiple nations, because enforcement is coordinated, because foreign militaries can't isolate and pressure individual nations, because we're united. This is the new reality. The reality where Africa isn't corridor, where African sovereignty means something, where foreign militaries operate on our terms or don't operate at all. Not the reality we inherited, not the reality of subordination and exploitation, not the reality where African borders were suggestions and African sovereignty was theoretical. New reality, created November 3rd, 2024, when drone swarm stopped NATO convoy, when detention proved enforcement was possible, when $124 million proved sovereignty violations cost money, when agreements proved African nations can force Western powers to negotiate on our terms. Reality that's spreading. Tanzania implementing port fees, Kenya charging airspace fees, Zimbabwe requiring case-by-case authorization, South Africa enforcing sovereignty through inspection rights. Each nation adding to the transformation. Reality that's permanent, not temporary assertion, not momentary defiance, permanent transformation of power dynamics, permanent enforcement of sovereignty. Permanent requirement that foreign militaries respect African authority. They can adapt to this reality. They can respect sovereignty. They can pay fees. They can follow procedures. They can ask permission. They can accept that Africa controls African territory. Most are adapting. NATO submits authorization requests. U.S. Africa Command budget sovereignty fees. French military includes compliance requirements and planning. British forces coordinate with African governments. Adaptation proving the new reality is real. Or they can face what that NATO convoy faced: detention, interdiction, public embarrassment, financial costs, diplomatic consequences. Proof that African nations can enforce sovereignty against Western military power. Some test the boundaries. Unauthorized flights, unannounced operations, assumed access. Each test gets detected, gets challenged, gets stopped. Each test proves enforcement is real. 3 unauthorized NATO flights since the corridor incident. 3 times we locked targeting radar. 3 times they diverted. 3 times proving we're serious. 2 unauthorized convoys attempted to use closed corridors. 2 times we deployed drones. 2 times they turned back. 2 times proving we enforce borders. 1 unauthorized base expansion without proper authorization. We revoked their operating license, made them remove equipment, made them pay penalties, proving we enforce agreements. Their choice, but either way, the corridor is ours, the sovereignty is real, the enforcement is certain, and nothing will ever be the same. The corridor belongs to Burkina Faso. We authorize access. We set terms. We collect fees. We enforce violations. Our corridor, our sovereignty, our control. The sovereignty is real. Demonstrated through detention. Proven through corridor closure. Enforced through agreements. Funded through payments. Real sovereignty with real consequences. Not symbolic sovereignty that exists only in constitutions and speeches. Not nominal sovereignty that foreign powers acknowledge verbally while violating practically. Not theoretical sovereignty that gets taught in universities but never enforced in reality. Real sovereignty, the kind that affects what foreign militaries can and cannot do on African territory. Demonstrated through detention of 200 NATO personnel. 5 days of holding Western military forces accountable for border violations. 5 days proving that African nations can arrest foreign soldiers who cross our borders without authorization. 5 days showing the world that sovereignty means something tangible, something enforceable, something real. That detention wasn't symbolic gesture. It was enforcement action with real consequences. NATO scrambled diplomatically. Western governments pressured us. Threats were issued. But the personnel stayed detained until NATO met our terms. Proven through corridor closure. 2 weeks of blocking NATO's primary logistics route through the Sahel. 2 weeks forcing them to use longer, more expensive alternatives. 2 weeks disrupting their operational planning. 2 weeks demonstrating that African nations control access to African territory. That closure cost NATO millions in additional fuel, time, and operational complications. Made their missions harder. Made their logistics more complex. Made their commanders rethink assumptions about African cooperation, real costs, real consequences, real sovereignty. Enforced through agreements that NATO didn't want to sign but had to sign. Written documents establishing authorization procedures. Clear terms requiring advance notice. specific provisions mandating payment, detailed clauses protecting sovereignty. Those agreements aren't suggestions, they're binding contracts. Violations trigger specific consequences: suspension of access, financial penalties, diplomatic protests backed by enforcement capability. NATO can't ignore these agreements like they ignored our sovereignty before, because now we have capability to enforce them. Funded through payments totaling $124 million, not promised payments, not future commitments, actual wire transfers, verified funds, money in Burkina Faso's central bank, money allocated to infrastructure, military modernization, education, and helping other African nations acquire sovereignty enforcement capability. That funding proves sovereignty violations aren't cost-free anymore, proves that disrespecting African borders has financial consequences, proves that African nations can impose penalties that foreign militaries actually pay. Real sovereignty with real consequences, consequences that NATO fears, consequences that change their behavior, consequences that make them ask permission instead of assuming access, consequences that transform the relationship between African nations and Western military powers. The enforcement is certain. Every violation gets detected. Every violation gets challenged. Every violation has consequences. Certain enforcement making sovereignty meaningful. Certain because we have the capability. 73 autonomous drones in each swarm, 12 swarms deployed across Burkina Faso, 949 total drones monitoring our borders continuously. 400 air defense systems covering our airspace, radar networks tracking every aircraft, surveillance systems documenting every border crossing. Every NATO convoy approaching our borders gets detected 80 kilometers out. Every aircraft entering our airspace gets tracked from the moment it crosses. Every unauthorized movement gets documented with video, radar data, and intelligence reports. Certain because we have the determination, willing to detain foreign military personnel despite diplomatic pressure, willing to close corridors despite economic threats, willing to demand payment despite intimidation, willing to enforce sovereignty despite costs. That determination isn't temporary, isn't dependent on my presidency, isn't limited to current political circumstances. It's institutional, built into our military doctrine, embedded in our national security strategy, permanent commitment to sovereignty enforcement, certain because we have the coordination, 18 African nations in our sovereignty network, real-time intelligence sharing, coordinated response protocols, mutual support commitments, collective enforcement stronger than individual enforcement. When one nation detects violation, all nations receive alert. When one nation challenges unauthorized transit, all nations provide support. When one nation faces pressure for enforcement, all nations stand together, coordination making enforcement certain across the continent. Every violation gets challenged, not ignored, not tolerated, not accepted as inevitable, challenged. Radio warnings to unauthorized convoys, radar locks on unauthorized aircraft, diplomatic protests backed by enforcement capability. Every single violation gets challenged. That challenge isn't empty rhetoric. It's backed by demonstrated capability. NATO knows we can detain their personnel because we already did. NATO knows we can close their corridors because we already did. NATO knows we can impose costs because they already paid $124 million. Every violation has consequences: financial penalties, operational disruptions, diplomatic embarrassment, loss of access, consequences that NATO actually fears, consequences that change their behavior, consequences that make sovereignty meaningful. Those consequences are proportional but certain. Minor violations get warnings and small penalties. Major violations get detention and corridor closure. Repeated violations get permanent loss of access. But every violation gets some consequence. Certainty of consequences making enforcement effective. Certain enforcement making sovereignty meaningful. Sovereignty isn't meaningful if it's not enforced, isn't real if violations are tolerated, isn't powerful if foreign militaries can ignore it without cost. Our enforcement makes sovereignty meaningful because NATO changes behavior. They submit authorization requests now. They pay fees now. They follow procedures now. They respect our borders now. Not because they want to, because they have to, because enforcement is certain. And nothing will ever be the same. Not for NATO, not for Western militaries, not for African nations, not for the relationship between Africa and foreign powers, Not for NATO because they can't assume African access anymore, can't plan operations without considering authorization requirements, can't execute missions without African cooperation, can't treat African territory as their logistics network. Everything changed for NATO. Their operational planning now includes African sovereignty compliance sections. Their budgets now include line items for sovereignty fees. Their timelines now include delays for authorization processes. Their risk assessments now include potential interdiction scenarios. Not for Western militaries because the precedent is established. If Burkina Faso can enforce sovereignty against NATO, other African nations can too. If detention worked once, it can work again. If corridor closure imposed costs, similar actions will impose similar costs. The precedent changes everything for Western militaries. French forces now negotiate basing agreements more carefully. U.S. Africa Command now coordinates operations more thoroughly. British military now requests authorization more formally. All because the precedent proves African nations can enforce sovereignty. Not for African nations because we proved it's possible. Proved that acquiring military technology is achievable. Proved that confronting Western power is survivable. Proved that enforcing sovereignty is effective. Everything changed for African nations. 7 nations deployed drone capabilities within 3 months of our corridor enforcement. 14 nations established air defense networks within 6 months. 23 nations joined sovereignty enforcement coordination within 1 year. The proof that it's possible catalyzed continental transformation. Not for the relationship between Africa and foreign powers because the power dynamic shifted. Foreign militaries used to dictate terms, now they negotiate terms. Foreign militaries used to assume access, now they request access. Foreign militaries used to violate sovereignty without consequences, now violations have consequences they fear. The relationship transformed from subordination to negotiation, from exploitation to mutual respect, from assumed access to authorized access, from free passage to paid passage, from violated sovereignty to enforced sovereignty. Everything changed November 3rd, 2024, when African nations said no and made it stick, when sovereignty stopped being theoretical and became real, when enforcement stopped being impossible and became certain. That date marks the transformation. Before November 3rd, African sovereignty was theoretical. NATO crossed our borders without asking. After November 3rd, African sovereignty is real. NATO asks permission before crossing. Before November 3rd, enforcement seemed impossible. African nations lacked capability, determination, or coordination to challenge Western military power. After November 3rd, enforcement is certain. We proved we have capability, determination, and coordination. When African nations said no and made it stick, not just said no, made it stick, detained personnel until demands were met, closed corridor until payment was made, enforced sovereignty until respect was demonstrated, said no and made it stick through capability and determination. When sovereignty stopped being theoretical and became real, stopped being words in constitutions, started being enforced at borders, stopped being diplomatic protests, started being detention and corridor closure, stopped being theoretical, became real. When enforcement stopped being impossible and became certain, stopped being something African nations couldn't achieve, started being something we demonstrate regularly, stopped being impossible dream, became certain reality. Nothing will ever be the same. The corridor incident changed everything, proved everything, transformed everything, established precedent that will shape Africa's relationship with foreign powers for generations. Nothing will ever be the same because African nations know enforcement is possible now, because Western militaries know African nations can challenge them now, because the world saw sovereignty being enforced successfully. Nothing will ever be the same because November 3rd, 2024 proved that African sovereignty is real, enforcement is certain, and the age of assumed Western access to African territory is over. Forever.